Joining us is Centre Alliance power broker Rex Patrick, power broker in terms of the Senate, because you've got the government to compromise on this ensuring integrity bill. What are the big changes? Talk us through it.
Yeah, sure. The bill is now a completely different bill to what was originally proposed. In short, we now have a threshold system whereby before an application can even be thought about, there must be multiple breaches by either union members or officials or unions, and then, and only then, can the Registered Organisation Commissioner make an application to a court. Previously, it was the Minister and an interested party. We've now got that being completely independent. And then when we get to court, the court must consider things like the gravity of offences. So no one's going to get pinged for misdemeanours. If someone makes a mistake and then makes another mistake, and several years later makes another mistake, they're not going to find themselves before the court, because the legislation now also has a provision in it which makes sure that the conduct must be systematic. So someone doing the wrong thing and doing the same thing again and again and again. And that's the sort of behaviour that unions like the CFMEU...
So it needs to be serious and systematic, is that right, in terms of being a breach? Because Michelle O'Neill was on this program yesterday saying that people could be basically deregistered for a financial infringement for not lodging their financial reports on time.
Yeah, look, if someone doesn't lodge their financial report on time, they may get a penalty against them, but one would think if you've been penalised for that, you would be very careful about that moving on. You'd realise you'd made a mistake, and that's not a mistake that you would make again. If you did that again and again and again, you then might come under the sort of auspices of this bill. So it's been designed very carefully to make sure that those sorts of misdemeanours, if they're mistakes, if they're genuine mistakes, people are not going to find themselves.
So basically, but there will be demerit points. Is that right? Because at the moment, the unions have been concerned that if 180 demerit points were enough to be deregistered, you could miss one financial report, maybe fail to train a board member for financial duties within 6 months, and then you're gone, because that's 200 points.
Okay, so that is only...
That's two infringements, gone.
The 180 points applies to members, not officials. Officials have a 900 point threshold. And indeed, it's the amendments as they have been drafted basically state that if you are a union official, you can only be held responsible for conduct that is within your sphere of influence, and you can only have points counted against you if you did nothing about correcting the problem. So once again, there are far more protections. There are lots of safeguards in there.
Are they comparable? Because you initially had said that you were concerned the bill needed a corporate equivalent. Is there one?
Look, there are corporate equivalents in terms of the ASIC being able to disqualify directors, and indeed there are automatic disqualifications.
At this sort of benchmark where it's
it's just
100 points or 200 points?
You can't compare apples and oranges, but for misconduct, certainly directors can be deregistered. And look, I know people have been saying this is targeting unions, but I've actually sat with the Treasurer's advisors, and they have laid out before me a range of bills that will be coming to this Parliament to deal with, for example, banking misconduct. It's not as though...
What about underpayment? We've seen a lot of that in terms of news lately.
Yeah, sure.
From some of the big retailers to other companies.
And I think the attorney is looking at that as well. So you need to look at this from a sort of a helicopter view, looking at what the Parliament is doing overall. They are looking at union misconduct, and we're talking about systematic misconduct with unions like the CFMEU. But the Parliament is also dealing with misconduct by directors. There is definitely...
But you don't believe, just to respond to the union's concerns, that people will be pinged for paperwork offences, essentially?
No, I don't think the bill with the protections in it allow for that. So, for example, when it gets to before a judge. The judge must consider the gravity of the offence, and a judge looking at...
and whether the person has that within their remit as well? Is that part of the judge's... if that's the person's responsibility?
Yeah, if it sits within the person's responsibility, that actually applies at the level where points are or are not counted. But ultimately, when you get before a judge, and you know, people will say, well, I don't want to go to court, but the Registered Organisation Commission is not going to bring actions to a court where there's not a reasonable prospect of being successful. And for someone who has simply had a few misdemeanours, it's unlikely that a judge would consider, when considering the gravity of the offence, would disqualify an official.
So if you also included that, the gravity of an offence, is that part of the
That is part of
legislation?
That is part of the amendments that are now agreed with by the government.
So it's whether it's systematic and the gravity of any such offence?
Yeah, so there are now checks and balances before an application can be made. We've isolated who can make an application to someone who's independent, and there are a whole bunch of other considerations that must be made by the judiciary before they could disqualify or deregister.
One last issue, I know that you and I have discussed this before. You want federal ministers to undertake the sort of security checks that public servants do when they enter the public service. They're exempt from that, but that's going to remain the case because the major parties don't want to pursue the suggestion that you've put up.
Yeah, look, it seems to be there is one rule for them and no rule for us, and that's a real problem. We took evidence. We know that ministers regularly receive top secret information, but there have been no checks in place. And there's a little bit about like the foreign interference or influence transparency scheme. Politicians were carved out of that legislation as well. We need to make sure that when we're dealing with security issues, that it applies equally to politicians as it does to members of the public.